So the first, speeding up kind of that CMS site creation workflow while improving performance. Everyone from an AEM perspective is familiar, whether you're building content, creating assets, the data requirements for a business is customized. The specific fields, the data, the taxonomy, the tags ultimately need to conform to business requirements, which can often come from business owners. The content creation process, though, starting before it ever gets into AEM and content's ready, can live in different teams, can live in Excel spreadsheets I've seen, workflow tools like Workfront or Primo, where teams are working and filling out data, which then ideally make it way to the content authors. The back and forth which can often happen can lead to content getting published with incorrect information that's required on the page to drive other decisions for SEO, keywords, etc. Things that aren't named properly because there is no, consistency across different systems. And so where we see one opportunity to increase that new content creation is to put that standard in place up front. So when there is a new piece of content that's created, we have a way to allow those standards to be managed, to create what we call different templates, understand what's the scope of who should have access to what fields, how to simplify that user experience. And this is a screenshot of that example where there's areas of a taxonomy that certain business units or certain teams should only have access to. So by minimizing that scope, we can simplify the process as well as make sure that all of the required fields and standards are applied before it ever gets to the content authoring teams. And again, there's everything from specific names, title tags, SEO tags that are used, custom fields, being able to manage that. In some cases, push it back directly, make edits and changes back into AEM directly. But for that new content flow, it's really about simplifying and making sure everything's standardized up front. So when the content's built and deployed and indexed by search engines, everything is structured as it's expected to be. To recap here, really speeding up that time by putting the standards up front and making sure that everything's tagged appropriately for both SEO and on-site search, and connecting content owners, business owners to the content authoring and publishing teams. All right, the second is reducing time finding duplicate assets. So I hear this time and time again, where one team may name something one way, another team may name something a different way. There's a great deal of effort spent creating assets, creating content across these organizations, and there's a repository of information, sometimes terabytes and terabytes of data. If you're searching and someone's searching for something, but they're not sure what they're looking for, in this case, we've got a red sweater example. I've heard, looking for images with hard hats, or other kind of random examples where, people are looking for a specific image to use in a new campaign. If things aren't tagged properly, structured the same and consistently, it can lead to someone not finding a piece of content and then therefore needing to put in a request to have a new piece of content created. So from our Claravine perspective, naming conventions and taxonomy being centrally managed, managing those requirements across teams, use cases, again, this is just a screenshot of how that can be controlled. And ultimately, the taxonomy is changing, naming conventions change, people come and go. You want to have that consistency across those different systems. And then as it works its way into what are the required fields, adding that consistency, those requirements to the fields within AEM can allow an easy way for business users to manage this data, make updates, quickly identify where there's gaps, retag content, etc., and obviously have those things be pushed back into and updated, whether it be assets, AEM assets or sites, but really kind of putting the controls in a centralized platform to manage those requirements. And ideally, when this happens, when things are named the same, and we'll talk about this in the next use case, but finding building assets allows the teams to, have content be reused and spend more time iterating and designing new content. The next one, this is one that kind of moves further into the process, where we talk to a lot of customers who have their creative assets sitting in their AEM DAM, but their media team needs to understand what creative assets should they use for their marketing campaign. And so a lot of that configuration for those operations teams still can live in spreadsheets, can still be very manual, and can still lead to, confusion or bottlenecks. And so teams are accelerating the number of creative assets that are being used to try and test and experiment and learn. But what that does is, by being able to create hundreds and thousands of different assets very quickly now, not having consistent naming and a handoff to those different operations teams leaves that burden and puts that bottleneck more on those teams to understand what creative asset should I use in what campaign, and making sure that it is the right creative asset. And again, all this is to instill trust in the output and the data that's generated for the measurement and data science teams. But the complexity of campaign configuration, this is just one screenshot of Facebook Ads Manager. You can replicate this across a number of different systems, and CTV and other things. Understanding what creative assets and videos and pieces of content are being used can be very, very painful and manual if there's not a standard in place for those teams. And so within Claravine, when we connect into AEM, we can help not just from a naming convention perspective, but there's a lot of work that goes into tagging creative assets and adding that metadata that we can help automate and pull in and connect into the operations team, which here you can see an example of where those creative dimensions, when they get connected into the operations team, can automatically populate and not have to be something that is manually tagged, which could often maybe be overlooked by the operations team. And again, the naming convention handoff from the content creative teams, creative agencies, if you will, that handoff can be streamlined, and the marketing and ad ops team can spend less time searching and making sure it's the right creative, but more time optimizing those campaigns and understanding, what creative is working and what creative is not working. And again, time to launch campaigns is accelerated and errors in deployment are reduced. And so oftentimes I think we think about errors as being incorrectly configured campaigns. That can also come in a way of a creative asset that was not intended for a specific audience, but everything looked good and looked right. And so I hear that quite often, that it's about making sure not just that things are working and functioning, but the right creative was put in front of the right audience again. So when we get to that measurement component, everybody trusts the inputs, therefore can trust. And so the last one, really maybe often overlooked, but being able to create a real-time feedback loop. So I've talked a lot about measurement. Everyone has their Adobe, Google Analytics. The world of measurement from a marketing and creative perspective is changing with a lot of the Apple and privacy changes and things that are happening kind of right now, and I see carrying on for the next year or two. But really being able to aggregate data at the right level across different teams and business units, such that you can quickly report on actionable insights. Oftentimes creative teams aren't clear on how the work they're doing can directly tie to the impact of the business, how the tagging work, taxonomy work can ultimately make its way into performance dashboards. And that that connective piece from creative to operations to measurement, and pulling in those creative dimensions can have a huge impact. And so again, I kind of mentioned this already, but being able to import those creative assets, those creative dimensions into the workflows of the various teams allows that automation and the connectivity, where you can structure across your different teams the dimensions that should be used for reporting, but also make sure that all of the teams are setting up the campaigns consistently. And then the hard work of the creative team is making its way and become kind of new dimensions and new assets that the data science team can use for automation and kind of a new light. And ultimately the goal is to get feedback back to the creative teams to understand what's working and what's not working in the next iteration of their designs. And then here, kind of more of a visual workflow as it relates to how does that work. Even just being able to connect in, we've talked a lot about kind of pushing updates and tagging back into AEM, but in this case, it's being able to just pull in those creative assets, allow them to be part of that workflow in these different execution systems, Facebook and Google just being two of those, and then connecting those into a variety of different systems, and kind of pushing it to different systems for different teams, where historically a lot of that information either has lived in the DAM or has been attempted to be retagged and reclassified after campaigns have gone live, which in some cases can be difficult if the campaigns aren't set up appropriately when they're launched, the data may not be able to be reclassified and reassociated to creative. So this, kind of structuring it up front from standards really allows for that fast feedback loop, because the teams can build their reporting structures, build their, measurement models, etc. And they spend less time doing it because they know they're getting consistent data, and then they can focus more on the analytics and insights, which can feed back into that feedback loop. Again, ideally getting it down to hours or maybe even closer to real time.